So let me show quickly what the impact of this is. I'm going to take the picture I had before and say, well, what would happen if Spain, this is all for Spain, what would happen if Spain could get 25 points more on the PISA test and the added knowledge? What would that look like in terms of the future growth and the future economic impact on Spain? And I'm going to look out in the future. So behind this, just so you all know, you don't do this instantly. You can't change the school instantly. So it presumes that over a 20-year period, your schools get 25 points higher on these tests. And then it looks at how much larger would GDP be with this gain versus without it over an 80-year period. So over a long period of time. But it puts that all in terms of the current values, in current euro value of improvement. So 25 points today would bring you up to essentially Iceland and Estonia. A little bit behind Estonia, but up to Iceland level. Slightly above the OECD average is what 25 points on PISA math does for you, according to 2009. Then you can sort of say, well, everybody looks to Finland. Nobody can actually copy these East Asian countries. Those people work so hard and so forth. But we can think of looking like Finland, right? Well, Finland, it's going to be 25 points of PISA, by the way, I didn't mention it, would, over the long run, amount to almost 0.5% of annual growth in the economy. Going to Finland is 1.33% per year additions to annual growth over what you'd expect without these improvements. And then the final thing that I'll show you quickly is what happens if you got to the Euro 2020 targets, which are basically much less. They're sort of focusing the achievement targets in Euro 2020, EU 2020 are to have less than 15% at level 1 on PISA or below by 2020. Level 1 on PISA, these things don't mean anything in general unless you study PISA. Level 1 on PISA is the following, that a 15-year-old can solve the following problem. I came here from California and I bought a ticket that cost me $2,000. The exchange rate between dollars and euros is 1.3. How many euros would my ticket cost? So it's not a really tough standard by most accounts, right? And the Euro 2020 standard is just that less than 15% of the 15-year-olds can't solve that problem. So I'll show you the impact of that. Currently, 22% of your students can't reliably solve that problem. Here's the impact. These are in billions of euros. Getting to Iceland is the 25 points. It's worth something over 3 trillion euros in present value terms. You can compare that to current GDP. It's roughly 3 times current GDP of Spain. Getting to Finland is something astronomical at over 10 trillion euros in present value. And getting to the Euro 2020 targets doesn't get you quite as much as getting to Iceland, but it gets you a long way. In terms of the whole future, the present value of future GDP, Iceland is a 6.2% improvement in average GDP. So another way to think about that is it's roughly a 12% pay rise for every worker in the Spanish economy for the next 80 years. So everybody on average gets a 12% pay increase. Getting to Finland is 20% of GDP or a 40% pay rise each and every year for every worker. And getting to this minimal level at the bottom end, bringing everybody up at the bottom end, is roughly a 10% increase in pay. So my point here is that the numbers are large enough to me to suggest that you should be willing to consider larger changes than just a small change in class size or something else that is unlikely by past history to have much impact, but seems to be politically feasible. This is where we get into the political feasibility, and it's an area where I'm not an expert in political feasibility, but it suggests to me that for the future of the Spanish economy, and the numbers here are about the same for the U.S. economy, just multiplied up by the fact that our economy is that much larger. But so countries have been able to change what they do, and I'll come back to this at the end. Here's sort of a picture of people who have taken these international tests over a long period of time so that you can see if there's any trend. So you see that Japan and Korea have always been high, but not too much change, a little bit of change in Korea. You can see Finland here, the hero of Europe because of its improvement, is a country that has managed to find a way to improve its schools. And then, nobody ever gets surprised when I show that Italy is at the bottom and falling. But you have these. Now, the reason for putting this up is because the question you should have been asking all along when I did this initial picture was, well, do you really think that this is a causal relationship? Do you really think that if we managed to improve our schools that we would change the economy? Okay. So if you believe that my story, that this is causally related, then you should think that countries that have very large increases in their test scores, where these lines are very steep, should also have seen that their growth rates, their annual growth rates, are rising. So they should have seen improvements in their annual growth rates. So for these small number of OECD countries, I can actually show you that. Here's the trends. Think of this as the slope of those lines, how steep those lines are in test scores. And here on the vertical axis is, if I take annual growth rates for each country and just draw a straight line through all of the annual growth rates, what you see is that everybody falls in the correct quadrant. Countries that have had improvements in their test scores have also seen that their annual growth rates have improved. Countries that have had lower growth or falls in their test scores have also seen that their annual growth rates have been at the bottom end of the scale and have fallen. So this is just in part to convince you that if you went through what it takes to improve scores, there is reason, according to historical evidence, to believe that your economy will, in fact, improve. Now, it's obviously a long distance between being able to solve math problems and the economy growing. But the idea behind this is very simple. Countries with better human capital both innovate more rapidly, and they have a workforce that can use modern technology better. And that leads to increased productivity throughout time and increased GDP. So that's the story that I wanted to give you. Let me turn to a little bit about what do we know from the evidence about how you might change these test scores. Now, in part, we've learned a lot, actually, I think, from the international assessments, from PISA. The international assessments were actually going on starting in 1964, But they weren't used very much until recently, whereas TIMSS and PISA have expanded and become more regular. A lot more people have tried to say, can we use that database to try to figure out why some countries are doing better than others and some are improving. And in some ways, it says what's possible. Here's just a picture of international testing. It turns out that this is up until 2007. It's actually expanded behind that. And what this is it's a frequency diagram, number of countries that have participated in varying numbers of tests. So the United States has participated in 15 different assessments, that where an assessment is by subject matter or age group or a different time. So we have science tests of fourth graders in 1982 and so forth, and you can get up to 15. And the OECD countries, what you see is that are in the dark. OECD countries have in general participated in more of these tests. Spain started participating in 1995 TIMSS and has participated in all the PISA, of course. And I'm not sure, are you still in TIMSS? Do you still do TIMSS?
It's both.
Doing both. This is the database that has given us some new information, but I want to talk about both information from within country databases and from the international test. So I'm going to try to give you an overview of some of this. Here's the sort of, what I said is there's been a sort of explosion of studies. There are, Ludger Woosman and I tried to summarize all of the economics work on these tests, and we find 60 different studies that are all within the last 10 years. When we've had PISA and TIMSS tests, we've had 60 studies, and one of the things that it's done is, that I'll highlight as we go along, is that there's a set of studies that I call cross-country studies of institutions. You can forget this. IEA is the TIMSS test, OECD is PISA, there's a couple other tests. But that's not relevant here. What it is think about some large institutions that countries have. For example, the German system has their dual education system, where very early on they put people into separate schools, one of which is getting vocational education, one of which is getting university preparation, and then there's a middle group that gets something in between. I can't study that within Germany because everybody in Germany faces the same schools. There's no comparison. So I have to look internationally, and I'll give you some data later on about some of the evidence on this, but I have to look at countries that in fact use this rigid tracking system versus countries that don't in order to get any idea of whether that makes sense. So I'm going to give you some of the evidence here. There's obviously all kinds of problems with doing that because somehow I have to find ways to adjust for the fact that the United States has a different culture and history and schooling system than Germany. And I have to somehow get around the fact that countries differ in lots of other ways. But I'm going to try to do that. Actually, researchers have tried to do that. I'm not going to try to do that today unless you question me on that. But I'm going to assert that this has been one of the key elements of the research that's going on in the background, is to try to take into account and find out how to compare countries when we know that they differ in so many different ways.